Welcome to the Empowered Women Life Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Karen Bashford. This podcast is for every woman who has ever felt limited by her past, silenced by trauma, or held back by society's expectations. Each week, we will share powerful stories, expert insights, and practical tools to help you become the leader of your own life. Today, my guest is Puya Delavar, and he is a gentleman that helps men deal with their relationships to avoid divorce or just general breakdown. He has a program that's 12 weeks long, which I think is phenomenal because from my own personal experience of relationships, that's a rapid transformation as far as I'm concerned. So welcome. Please introduce yourself and share what you want to tell us about what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen. It's really great to be here. So I am Puya Delavar, and I do have a program of 12 weeks. It's called Crisis to Connection. And as you said, I help men to try to avoid divorce or separation. So typically my clients are people who have been in a long-term relationship, whether it's a marriage or just a long-term relationship. And because of the impact of pressures from work and other pressures from life, they've possibly haven't had as much focus or attention on the relationship. And because of that possible neglect, they've let things go and the relationship is going into the direction of separation. And I help them bring a little bit more awareness. I say a little bit, a lot of awareness onto where they're at and help them transition from a looming separation to a thriving relationship. And yes, my program is 12 weeks and it's been very successful, but I do have clients that have stayed for much longer because they feel that that's helped them be able to sustain that thriving relationship as they want.
And I can understand why that is, because from my own personal experience, I stayed in an abusive relationship and a relationship that basically should never have happened for way too long. But for somebody who recognizes that relationships can be beneficial as well as harmful, can you explain to me how you got involved?
How I got involved in the topic of, yes, yeah. Absolutely. So I'm not actually, my background isn't actually in coaching. I've worked for around 25 years as a business relationship manager, and I've worked in a number of industries such as the financial industry. So these are very high pressure positions that I was in. But I was fortunate that I've always had a position where I've had to understand people. So this aspect of this, let's say, behavioral psychology has helped me understand what makes people tick, what makes them do what they want to do, and has brought me a little sense of awareness of the fact that if we understand ourselves better, we can understand other people better, and we can work with that to try to improve how our relationships overall. Now, whether that it's a private, personal, romantic relationship or even relationships at work, having that sense of understanding has helped a lot. About, I would say, just over 10 years ago, where I had just been married and my first kid was born, I went through a problem myself. I went through a crisis that affected me personally and affected my relationship. And I was heading towards divorce. And I didn't understand why. And this was a situation where I thought I was doing everything right. And I was definitely in a position where it was affecting my health. It was clearly affecting my relationship because my wife, in many ways, hinted the fact that we're going to separate if things don't change. And the idea of that was so devastating for me that I decided to make a massive change in my life. So I quit my job. I started researching about relationships, what makes them work. And since I had the background in behavioral psychology, a little bit more understanding on how people work, that helped me get maybe get on the right path, read the right books, contact the right people. And over 10 years of research has gone into me understanding what really makes a relationship work and what makes it fail, really, because that's the main thing. And I absolutely, I'm not in the mindset that your relationship has to survive no matter what. So you mentioned that you were in an abusive relationship. I've actually seen men in abusive relationships from their partner. And I say that I'm only there for them only if they see that there is a chance and they would like to put effort into the relationship. And even if the relationship doesn't work out, the knowledge they get from me is then able to help them with their future relationship. So if it's a second marriage or a different relationship.
I can understand that as well, because I'm very conscious that I went from my marriage into another relationship without taking time out to get to know myself, to understand what was wrong, in the sense of, obviously a relationship is two ways. So yes, my partner, husband, was obviously doing something wrong, but then so was I. But I didn't take the time out to explore that. So consequently, I then went back into another abusive relationship. But I can understand why we forget that we need to communicate in a relationship. So you must see men who are very, very good at work, but they don't have the same kind of communication with their family.
That is absolutely right.
So explain that a bit for me, because obviously this podcast is very much for women. So yes, having your perspective from a man would perhaps help them understand their partners a bit better.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think there is a lot that we share, men and women. We definitely are different in many ways, but understanding the perspective of our partner plays such a big role in us being able to be successful in a relationship. And a couple of things on what you said, it's very interesting. So obviously you've learned through certain difficulties on what went wrong and what you could possibly avoid in the future. Typically, and this is something I say quite often, we seem to go and study for years on a career. For example, if you want to become a doctor or an engineer, we go to university, study years just so we can get an entry level position for something that we will do for a lifetime. But something as important as a relationship, we go in it without being properly equipped or having the right knowledge. The knowledge we get is either from past experiences or maybe from parents or society. And unfortunately, this isn't enough for us to always make it work. This is why I ended up studying for about 10 years. And when I started studying, the more I studied, the more I realized how little I knew. And I thought I was very good at this because this was partly my job to understand people. But it really is the case where most of us go into a relationship with a certain level of expectation that we've built and this baggage we bring from either past relationships or from what we've learned from our parents. And if this expectation isn't communicated, exactly like you said, the communication first, we go in it with a set of expectation. And if this isn't met, this then results in them turning into resentments. So as an example, we might go into a relationship expecting, okay, well, I would like to travel the world, or I'm making a very extreme example here. But whatever the expectation is, if that isn't communicated, then, and if it isn't met, then it ends up in disappointment. And these small expectations end up becoming huge problems later on. And what I've seen is that that is the same for men and women. Men go in with a different set of expectation, women the same. And if that isn't communicated through time, that becomes more and more difficult to deal with. You always think, well, I actually wanted this and it never happened. So why is that? And that is what I see. And this is what I really help my clients to put everything on the table and go through an exercise of taking off the layers that they pile on top of this resentment, this expectation that is never met. And this comes across, it comes over as problems that seem trivial, but they touch an underlying need that isn't met, that touch an underlying expectation that was never met. And we have no ability to be able to verbalize that correctly. And it just ends up with us being abusive to our partner. So I help them be able to understand the basic needs, understand their past a little bit better, understand themselves a little bit better, just so that they can communicate. And that's a really important word that you mentioned, so that they can communicate their desires and expectations better, so that they can probably meet, have a common ground, so that they can solve the issues better together.
That's a big one. I know from my own personal relationship and working with the clients I work with, quite often there is an element missing in the 5 languages of love. We forget that our language of love is not necessarily the same as our partner. So for me, one of my languages of love is time. I have to have quality time. And that quality time is not sitting in front of a TV watching some program that I don't particularly want to watch. It means actually doing something together, even if it's just doing something in the house together. But I find more and more there's this disconnect of what really is required to be communicated in a relationship. Like, my partner used to love cooking, but I didn't want him cooking. So I got irritated by that. And yeah, I know for him, touch was highly important.
Right.
So we were constantly on edge with each other because he wasn't giving me the quality time. And I wasn't necessarily feeling that I wanted to touch him because I was resenting the fact he wasn't giving me the time. Yes. So how do we even start a relationship with those clear sort of structures in place and a clear understanding? So I'm perhaps taking you beyond what you do, but I also feel that it's quite important is if you're going to help a relationship thrive again, that things like that are mentioned.
Yes. No, it's very important. So see, we love stories as people. We always have our own story. And when we enter a relationship, we bring that story with us. Mm-hmm. So whether that's made by our childhood or other experiences that we've had in our life, we have a story. And I always recommend, and most of the time I actually work with clients that have been in long-term relationships. So it's difficult to say, okay, let's go back 20 years. Obviously, we can't do that. But it's important to understand what story did we enter a relationship with. And if that hasn't been communicated, which is what I mentioned, put on the table, made clear, then now is really the time to do that. To say, okay, this is what I would like to happen. This is my love language. So we might not necessarily be aware of our language. It's great that you were, and you were aware what you dislike about your husband. But putting everything on the table and saying, this is me, this is what I enjoy. What about you? What do you think? Just so that it comes across as an exchange. And that even if that isn't met, that's been communicated. So at least the person is aware that my partner likes this or dislikes this. And this is very important. And that changes your behavior automatically. Mm. Because one thing that we all have in common in any relationship is that we all have a fundamental, an underlying reason why we're in there. So we go in a relationship, and at the very beginning, we both want the same thing, which is being in that relationship. It might seem common sense, but falling back on that underlying reason that we're in the relationship is very important. So we know that we have something in common. And once we have that, okay, we both want to make sure this lasts. Most of the time, this is the case. So what else can we bring to this? And putting everything on the table, everything, the good and the bad and the ugly, just being as open and honest as possible is very important. And we don't do that. We don't communicate. We go in thinking, well, this is me. He has to like me the way I am, or she has to like me the way I am, without communicating it. And that because it's not communicated, when it's not, it frustrates us. And we think, well, why is she behaving like that? And therefore, it changes the way we then behave back. So one of the exercises that I do with people is I tell them to communicate with the point of view of yourself. So don't go in with resentment, say, oh, you are like this and I don't like the way you do. Just say, this thing that you did made me feel a certain way. And you're putting things on the table from your perspective and how it made you feel, rather than looking as if you're actually blaming the other person. So it doesn't become a blame game where you put the defenses up and then you start blaming, and the other person then puts the defenses up, becomes a fight. Rather than doing this, you focus on what is it that you're fighting for, rather than what are you fighting about. And this is very important. When you understand what you're fighting for, you realize actually more often than not, you're fighting for the same thing. And for what I mean is that there's a positive goal that you can focus on. We're just coming at it from a different angle, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So, what am I feeling? There's
What
almost,
example?
I think, it's almost like we forget that we are our family. And when we've come into a relationship, and I know now from my own experience of having been through the 2 abusive relationships and looking at my own family relationship, there is an element that we bring in of an expectation that is how we're expecting somebody else to behave. Mm-hmm. We forget that they're individual, that they have their own family stories or their own stories. How would you approach a situation where a wife or a husband has suddenly realized that they don't like their family? Because that happens. I'm a prime example. I can't stand my family. I really can't. So I've stepped away from them. But if you're in a relationship, that could be a tough one, because you've then got to explain to your partner that actually I'm not having anything to do with them. Mm. And if the relationship isn't as good as it could be, how do you get around those kind of dynamics?
It's a really important point, because our childhood and the dynamics that we're exposed to when we're younger, when we grow up, shapes us so much, and we don't realize how much of an influence it has on us. And there's a statistics that I bring to people, and that is, if you are a child of parents that are separated, you're 50% more likely to separate yourself, so get a divorce. And that's because those are the dynamics that we're exposed to. So this is the example that we see. So we half expect that to happen, and we have that mindset in us. So to break that pattern is very difficult. But I think it's very important to do what you did, which is understand, do you like something about your family, or do you dislike something? And if there is things that you dislike, it's very important to, in my opinion, to decouple yourselves from those, because these are the baggages that you bring into a relationship. And if they're not good, if they're not serving you, leave them, throw them out. If anything, any mindset that isn't serving you, in my opinion, you should let it go. Unfortunately, a lot of us live in the past, so we bring in with a lot of memories, and we keep going back to it. This is what happened in my previous relationship, and we keep wanting to relive it. Somehow we feel as if this is identifying us. In my opinion, having a clear cut is so important, just so that rather than focusing on how things were, think about, what do I want my ideal relationship to be like? And then live in the present and make that your reality. And if you can decouple yourself from the past, you're in a much more much stronger position to be able to have an ideal relationship that you actually like, because you're actually focusing on the positives, on how you want things to be, rather than what you don't want things to be like. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. I'm just thinking of a young lady I've worked with recently who basically is starting to realize that what her partner is her old family. Mm. Now she's working on herself, and he's picking up that there's these changes taking place, which is consequently making him feel very insecure. So how would you recommend that the man, the husband, deal with that kind of situation? Because that's going to happen more and more, I'm sure, as more and more women recognize that they have a say over their own lives.
Yes.
And consequently, poor partners suffer. So how would you recommend a man be able to deal with that kind of situation? Because that is going to impact him terribly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's better to be realistic than living a lie. So if you're in a relationship where you've had to put up a pretense in order to make things work, in my opinion, this isn't serving you, and it's definitely not serving your partner, because I always encourage open and honesty, especially at the beginning of a relationship. But if it hasn't happened at the beginning of a relationship, for whatever reason, it might be that we ourselves weren't conscious of certain baggage that we bring, or the wrong mindset that we're bringing into it. But at the time where we become conscious of it, like your friend, then it's important to communicate with our partner. And in my opinion, the man should, it is extremely worthwhile to have that open and honest discussion. And I think the men should have a sense of gratitude that their partner are being open and honest about it. Because if you are trying to end the relationship, it's a different story. But if you want to continue the relationship, and that's the reason that you're bringing up an issue that is bothering you, that basically is a sign that you want a positive outcome. So in this situation, I definitely recommend the men to have an understanding of why this is happening. Your partner isn't coming and starting putting in blame as what you need to change, but she's opening up and say, these factors are affecting me in a negative way, and I would like them to change so that we can continue our relationship, so that we can have a future together. And I recommend the men to have that sense of gratitude rather than putting up their, let's say, defenses and say, oh, are you blaming me again for whatever reason? That's not an easy thing to do. That requires coaching, that requires a helping hand for someone who's an expert, by someone who's an expert. But it's I've seen people disconnect in their relationship purely because, especially in mid ages, so in midlife, purely because what they wanted at the beginning of a relationship has changed, and they've stuck together because of whatever reason. Maybe could it be kids, and then the kids grow up and move, and suddenly you realize, oh, actually, I'm not the same person I was 20, 30 years ago. And that causes a separation. But that doesn't have to be that way. So if the communication can be done with guidance, then you can realize actually there's so much that you do have in common. There are things that you don't, but there are things that also keep you together. And if you can focus on that and build on it, then you definitely have a future together, if that's what you want.
And it is the need to be with that person rather than just staying for the sake of staying. So what would you say is the biggest cause of potential separation or divorce?
That's a really good question. I would say, I mentioned it earlier, I would say it's unmet expectation. Seems to me the number one cause. Now, everybody is different, so that expectation could be different. It could be that there could be a financial expectation that isn't met. It could be a health expectation. It could just be that the person is hanging around the wrong group of people. It could be so many different things. But if the expectation isn't met, you're constantly disappointed, and that constant disappointment is a build-up resentment, which is guaranteed for to cause you separation. In midlife, it could also be a number of other things. It could be a change in our physical to hormonal changes. So obviously, menopause has a big effect on separation. But again, all of those can, if where they're understood well, if the desired outcome isn't a separation, it can be worked on. Not all the time. And again, I don't want to emphasize on the fact, I don't want to stress the fact that I'm against separation. In certain cases, separation is definitely the right answer in the right situation. But if both sides want to work on it, there's definitely a way to make it work. Unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer of what the main cause of separation, because there's such a large spectrum of reasons for it, but it seems to be more popular towards midlife than earlier.
I think that's also because as we get older, we start stepping into our true selves. We start recognizing that we have more say, perhaps, than we might have done previously. And I also think circumstances of what you've been through together and as a separate individual plays a part in how we then start to look at our lives as we get older. And I also think there's this recognition that actually I don't have that much time left. So what do I want? Yes. And I'm a prime example. I'm looking at my life and thinking, okay, so the business is now starting to do this. What do I actually want? And that's changing me in a way that I hadn't thought was going to happen. And I think for as much for men as for women, when we start looking at ourselves and questioning ourselves, we do see things that perhaps we want differently, or that perhaps we have never really thought about, and then start thinking, well, I'd like to do this. And again, it's that communication with your partner to say, well, my outlook on life has changed. What do you think of this? And I so agree with you. Never, ever, ever point the finger at somebody and say it's their fault, regardless. Guaranteed to cause problems, I'm sure.
Every time. Yes. So I love that.
Sorry, go on.
No, I wanted to say I love that you brought this idea of asking a question, what is it that you want? This is such a powerful question, and I think everybody should ask themselves this question at some point in their life for sure. But this is actually one of the first steps of my program. I asked the men, okay, what is it that you want? And you'd be surprised what the response is to such a simple question. A lot of people have never allowed themselves the opportunity to ask themselves this question. So they're startled by it, and they have to think for me a few minutes, what is it that I want? What's interesting is that even the first answer that they give isn't really what it is that they want. There's so much attachment, so that there needs to be a process of and I have a process that you ask this question, and then there's 4 steps, and you go back to that question again. And when you ask the same question the second time, you realize the answer is different, because what you thought you wanted might not be what you actually wanted. You want the result of what you wanted. But in any case, I'll go into that. But yes, 100%. It's very important for us to be more self-aware, to look at our circumstances, like you said, to understand, okay, at this stage where I am now in my life, what is it that I really want? If what I want includes my partner, then great, let me work towards that. If it isn't including my partner, then let me communicate that it doesn't need to be the need for aggravation or any kind of abuse. It's just there needs to be communication. That's all.
Yes. I would totally agree on that, based on the fact that communication with my family has been one-sided, to say the least. So to me, especially in the place where I am now, I tend to say what I really think. And I think that sometimes shocks people because we do not give ourselves that permission to really say what we need to say. Obviously, I'm not going to say something that's deliberately going to hurt somebody. I will express it in a way that is acceptable, perhaps. But at the same time, I'm not going to go against what is important to me. Right. So for me, a relationship has to be a bonus, not just an expectation. Mm-hmm. So yes. Let's finish then with, what would you say to any woman who's in a relationship where she's looking at it, and I'm probably putting you on the spot here, so my apologies, and she's looking at it and thinking, is not working? Mm-hmm. How would she approach the man, would you suggest?
Okay, that's a really good question. I love that. In my opinion, when I work with the men, I have basically boiled down the reasons why with someone to 3 underlying needs that we have. And if any of these needs aren't met, or a combination of these needs aren't met, it creates a problem. It creates a crisis or a problem or an argument. So one of the exercises is for us to take every argument that is happening in a relationship and then taking the layers off and finding out what is this underlying need. So in my opinion, it's important to understand what your needs are. And if none of your needs can be met by your partner, then in that case, being in a relationship with that person doesn't make any sense. It doesn't bring you anything anymore. So this ties in together with what is it that we want. If it is companionship, for example, if this is one of the needs, then of course, someone we've been with for a long time and are familiar with, then we have a lot of grounds to work on. If companionship isn't one of the needs, then of course, we need to be aware of that. So just touching very briefly on these 3 needs, the first need that we have in any relationship is the need for closeness. Now, that doesn't necessarily include only physical closeness, but emotional closeness. So just what you mentioned earlier, having the presence of someone next to you, that is so valuable in relationships. Just to feel that I enjoy that person next to me, that is the companionship. So that is the feeling of closeness. So the feeling of trust, the feeling that you're being cared for, that is the first need. That's important for us to understand if we have that need, or do we prefer to be a solitary person? Because some people do. So it's important to recognize that. The second need is the need for recognition. So they feel that that you value, that your opinion matters, that you're respected, that you are bringing the same level of contribution towards a relationship, that you matter in a relationship. That needs is very important. And again, a lot of times arguments boil down to the fact that people don't feel valued enough in a relationship. If that's important for you, then it's important to have someone that you feel valued by. And again, this needs a little bit of work, so it's important to work with an expert when it comes to this. And the third need is to, again, this boils down to being in a relationship, to feel equal. So to feel that your priorities are as important as your partner's priorities, not that they're worth less, that you are being respected by your partner, and that everything that you do is of equal importance in a relationship, so that you're not here and your partner isn't there. You don't want to feel, you want to feel as a peer in a relationship. If any of these 3 needs isn't met in a relationship, then it causes an issue. So I think for women to think whether they want to be in a relationship, it's important to understand what are the needs that they would like to be met by being in a relationship. If there aren't any, that can be ticked, then in my opinion, of course, it's more beneficial not to be in a relationship. And again, then I recommend sitting down and communicating that with your partner without it causing, don't bottle it up so it explodes one day and it causes even more damage than needed.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful, actually, because I'm sure a lot of women will recognize for them that is something that might be missing in their lives, just as it is in some men's lives. And, I'm very much about communicating both ways. So, yes, it's been absolutely great having you on here.
It's been great to be here, Karen.
Tell me how we can contact you.
Yes, of course. So I have a presence on LinkedIn, so I have a profile. You can always find me there. So my full name, Puya Delavar. If you search for that, I'm the only one with that name, so you wouldn't find anyone else. I also have a website, which is just my name, so puyadelavar.com. You can find that on the internet. But I would recommend, if you want to get in touch with me, just search me out on LinkedIn, send me a message. And if I can be of help, I'm happy to have a chat.
Thank you. Well, obviously, I will be putting your details in the information once the podcast and video goes live. But thank you for your time. Gratefully appreciated and quite insightful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. It was a pleasure.